Hey!
Hey!
Woo! Yeah.
Hi!
Hi, welcome to the library's 12:30 talk. This is, and Kristen, could you not sit right there? Sorry. We've had a request to record these before, so starting now we're gonna record them. So only say things you want to say for posterity. But this is our third or fourth year of doing these little lunchtime talks that are kind of informal about all different kinds of topics. We've had professors, sometimes we've had students presenting work, all kinds of fun stuff. And this is the first time any of the librarians have ever given the talk in the library. I know, isn't that crazy? But so here we go. We have a theme this year. Our theme is different reflections or ideas and aspects of diversity in different sorts of ways. And so Natalie and I are actually going to give this together. We're both reference and instruction librarians here. But she's going to start while I make sure the recording is working since I'm the host. And then we'll be doing it together. So it's going to be a little bit interactive. So we hope you learned something and have fun. Go Natalie!
Yay! Thanks, Mike, for that wonderful introduction for our joint presentation. So we call this Not in My Library, Diversity, Oppression, and Information. And the idea of Not in My Library is talking about what libraries, the role that libraries play in our communities. So to get started, what do you guys think librarians do?
Awesome things. Everything.
Okay, read books, everything. You can say knit. I can hear you. Knit. What other kinds of things do librarians do? I mean, maybe let's narrow down everything.
They understand the information superhighway.
Oh. Information superhighway.
Create access.
Create access. I saw a hand up in the back.
Help students do research on different topics, different subject matter.
Yeah. And I might even swap that word out of students to just talk about any of their patrons or users, because that also might relate to librarians that work in public libraries or special libraries. Anything else?
Managing the resources.
Managing the resources.
Is that fair? We have some readers in here.
Yeah.
Just a couple.
So this is a great list of all the things librarians do and all the ways they interact with information and they help other people get information. And when I do a Google image search for librarian, you can obviously see that books are a really big theme in all the photographs. There's just one.
As are cardigans.
Yeah.
So you weren't wrong about knitting.
Yeah, cardigans, some sweater vests. A row of glasses, a little kid that's shushing, classic library stuff. But what Mike and I wanted to talk today about was critical librarianship. And that is taking all the things that the librarians do and think about it in terms of power dynamics. So who controls information, who has access to information, how is information organized, and who creates those categories, and thinking about it in a critical way. And a lot of times that includes adding social justice in the library. So one of the definitions that we listed here is a change in the frame of library values. And we say change because the profession has changed a lot. Libraries, especially in the South, were segregated. They didn't allow for certain people to come in based on race, what library you got to go to. Libraries also used to have closed collections, so they didn't even let people into the book areas. The profession has changed from being a male-dominated profession to a more female-dominated profession, and there's a lot of power dynamics that come into play there and what it means to be a female offering service in an industry. But the big part is also power and privilege and how libraries function both inside their spaces and in connection to the broader communities that they serve, whether that's a campus community like an academic library or a public library, so the city or the county or the municipality they belong in. I thought Mike was just going to come back.
Yeah, I am going to come back. No, that's fine.
So I
Wanted to
really
both
like
sit
this
down.
quote, and this is from Pat Schumann, who is one of the presidents of the American Library Association. Talks about neutrality, and she says neutrality can obfuscate injustices and the possibilities for active contributions. Often neutrality is not a defense of the controversial, but rather an avoidance of it. And I think that's a really nice quote to kind of frame what we're going to be talking about in the rest of this presentation in terms of libraries as neutral spaces, or spaces where people can have conversations, where they can learn about different topics and information. That neutrality can be problematic. And so what do we mean by neutral? And is neutral always a good thing? And that definition, just to go back to critical librarianship, has a lot to do with social justice. And so how do we imbue social justice values into the ways that we provide access for information? So we're going to
We're going to talk about this in 3 different kinds of ways or aspects of library stuff. And the first one is going to be service. So we want to pitch some ideas at you, and then we want to have some small group discussion and stuff, because we believe in active learning here in the library. So, service is going to be first, then information literacy, and then cataloging, organizing stuff. So let's start with service.
I split them into 2 screens.
Oh, good. She changed the slides while I was in class.
Sorry.
So, how we think of service and power dynamics could play out in lots of different kinds of ways. A really sort of straightforward one is, maybe not as straightforward, is the spaces. What are our spaces like? And are they set up in a way that reinforces unconscious dynamics or challenges them? So, an interesting one to think about here is that there is a good amount of research on how intimidating reference desks are. Natalie and I are very intimidating, as you can see, very scary, but it's a real thing. And so, does how we have that space set up change the dynamic between the student and ourselves, or not?
Like our standing desks, really great because they allow someone to just walk in, but also is that accessible for someone that is in a wheelchair or has other kind of physical limitations? That all came together.
But it could mean lots of other things too, like access to technology. Are we making sure that we have come up with ways, again, that could mean disability access, but it could mean other sorts of things. But fundamentally, it also revolves around questions of who are these spaces for? Who is the population that we want to serve? And here at UB, we have students, but who else do we serve? Yeah, on some level, the public, right? Are our spaces and our configurations and the services we provide really set up for the public in a good way, or not? It's an open question. And of course, it could reflect staffing and hiring practices too, to try and make sure that we don't just have all white men all the time.
Yeah, so like who do we hire? What kind of values do we provide to people that work on our frontline areas? So like who's the first person that you see when you walk into the library, and does that make you feel more welcome than someone else that you see? Like, are we providing best customer service practices? Do we make people feel like they belong in a certain space and that space was built for them? So that's an idea of radical hospitality that I'm really into right now, that I talk about a lot. But it's the idea that you've not just made a space for someone, but that you've made a space that they feel like they actually see themselves reflected in and that they belong in. So if you think in just like really simplistic terms, a space made for a child versus a space made for adults. You're going to do things that if you're making a space for a child, you're going to do things that have a lot of color in it, that have low things on shelves that they can reach, that don't have dangerous things on shelves that they can reach. So you're thinking about how is that child going to use that space and what's going to be the most comfortable thing for that child. Similarly, just thinking about different user groups. So what's going to be the best for a student? How are they going to use that space? How can you design it? Or in our case, I say students, but
not only students.
Right, not only students, but any kind of user in your library. So how are you designing those spaces to make your population feel welcome in their library? Oh.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Clearly we had a lot of time to practice this together. So service also relates to policies. And policies are a big thing. They tell you what you can and cannot do. And so part of critical librarianship is considering who gets to write those policies. And if who gets to write those policies is staff and administration, do staff and administration reflect the population that you're trying to serve? So when we look at public libraries, there's a lot of rules about what you can and cannot do. Sleeping might be one of them, how you use the restrooms, and that kind of limits the homeless population in terms of how they might be using the space. And is that welcoming? I mean, sometimes we create policies to make people feel safe, and that's often an, I don't know if excuse is the right word to use, but justification is that we want to make people feel safe in our spaces. And so safe for who though? So who's that population that you're thinking about in terms of being safe? So policies is one way that that's enacted, and that's really important if you're practicing critical librarianship and thinking about social justice is who are those policies meant for, who gets to write them, are there reasons for them beyond just like one single person's or one single
Said
user
it
group's
at some point.
feelings.
So that could also mean things like noise levels, which is a big concern in all libraries, I think. There's this idea that we all want to run around and shush you. But maybe there's tension there. What noise levels are best for what groups and in what spaces? Food policies. Yeah, and I see nodding about food policies. Yes, that could make a big difference if you imagine someone who's spending a lot of time here. And then content challenges as well. And we're going to come back to the idea of challenging content right at the end of our presentation. But I think we want to move you into the first discussion,
Yeah.
which is about your display case. So most libraries have display cases. And often they're controlled by us, the librarians. But they don't have to be. And if they aren't, that could raise interesting questions. So what if we wanted to let the public or student groups make or run our display cases for a little while? And then we're approached by a Bible study group who wants to use the display case. So we thought we'd have you discuss, the little tables for a minute, some of the ramifications or power dynamics at play in letting students or users create display cases and what kind of content that will be and who it makes feel welcome and who it doesn't. Discuss!
Even with for the project, have a group to considering the action. The Bible to do this stuff. You can have a group to decide which
But I think how you decide
If it's not
if it's tied to class,
Right.
that might be a rule.
If it's like HR Bible study
It's
group,
gonna display the type of
our
because
religion,
this
we're like
is
promoting our group.
if you allow
Well, and another thing
That's what we
is,
provide.
if it's overly
Yeah.
Right.
right, and do that, does that mean it's okay, or is violate the same rule?
the question. So,
It certainly can be. I think
Okay, so just keep it moving on. I realize we maybe haven't had a whole lot of time to discuss.
It's gonna be.
what is the
Yeah, I know. It doesn't matter, stop them.
Okay. So I'm gonna stop your conversations, and there'll be time at the end to kind of go over some of the things you're talking about here. And I realize I'm cutting some people off, but what are some ideas or themes that you guys came up with at your tables?
Separation of church and state.
Okay, separation of church and state. So you're
Advocacy versus education.
Great, advocacy versus education. I'm actually write some of these down, so I'm gonna forget. Yeah, oh,
No, I was just saying, went a little broader than that.
yeah, what are might be some specific things that you talked about, or some specific issues that came up?
Rob was just saying, you're saying it's a group outside of the library, and does that display represent the library or the community? I was thinking, if communities are temporarily holding up their displays, maybe that's okay, because it's just allowing people in the community to be represented.
Great. That first group, what was the theme that you talked about, or did you not?
We kind of went all over the board.
Okay.
But the last thought was, could we create a display that we don't necessarily endorse, but allow people to use the space? And how would that endorsement or non-endorsement look like? Or what would that non-endorsement look like?
Great.
You introduced the framework of whether something like that would be welcoming.
Yeah.
We talked about how that's probably not the most useful framework, just because people might feel unwelcome, but that is kind of unavoidable.
Yeah.
It would just be super bland.
Right.
And
Right.
then somebody would be offended by that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm offended.
Designers would come and be like, ugh, your library.
The beige library.
Not, instead, we just turn all of our books around so there's no spines facing out. That's the trend these days. Back table, do you have anything you wanted to add?
We were talking about that it might be a really nice idea, to allow students or student groups or affiliate with a class. That seems like it furthers the educational mission. And then we were talking about, well, what happens if, especially if it's not tied to a class, if it is, if it does, make some people feel unwelcome, and then, said, well, maybe we need a policy, but then we were kind of going back to your point about who makes those policies. Just do groups make the policies, staff make the policies, like how would you work, to make it, to come up with a set of rules, because it doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be that you can't do this. Maybe it just means if you want to make a welcoming environment, you have to think of, you need to, pair it with the right thing so that it's not, so it, in total it presents a more welcoming environment type of thing. So there are other ways to handle it other than banning it.
Yeah, and I should also point out, it's not that all policies are bad policies. That is, you need some policies to help with the function of your space. But that if you're questioning or thinking critically about those policies, that kind of gets you in that mindset of thinking about those power dynamics. And these are questions that come up quite a bit. I was at a conference last week that was talking about public libraries and spaces in terms of renting rooms and letting different groups use your rooms in your library space. And if you allow one group to meet, what about another group? And there's someone gave the example of they have a church group that is men only go to their meetings. They do not allow women into their meetings. And so the library had to think about, if we let this group use our rooms, can we say you can tell who can and cannot come into meetings? And so they created a policy that said, you can have whatever meeting you want in the library, but it has to be open to the public. And so while you don't necessarily have to advertise it or invite people from the public in, if a woman wants to walk into your meeting, you cannot kick her out of that space. And so thinking about what's important to you in the library, and that kind of goes to those ideas about what you're endorsing and what your advocacy, someone mentioned advocacy versus education, Laura, and what the difference of that is. And so if you have a group that's a Bible study group, does that match with what you want to promote in your library? And if you're promoting a bunch of rotating groups that are these are people in our community, that's endorsing this overall idea of letting the community see themselves in those spaces. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Let's turn to information literacy. Yay, this is the thing that Natalie and I both love, since we're both information literacy teachers. And this notion of power dynamics and critical relationships plays out here too, right? So considering power and privilege and how we find, evaluate, and use information, and how we teach students or other patrons and members of the community to do the same thing.
And those would be information literacy skills.
Right.
This is a
All
definition of
informa-
information
yes.
literacy.
Sorry.
It's how we find, evaluate, and use information, both as consumers and as people that
Producers.
produce information.
Yep. So what are some examples of how that could play out, right? So one thing that we might talk about is the bias or power that is inherent in search engines, their algorithms, and their dominance. Anybody have any idea what percentage of searches are Google searches?
Probably 80%.
It depends a little bit depending on whether you're looking at like mobile searches or searches from kind of like desktops, but it's
High.
It's very high, yes, very high. And so that gives Google a lot of power. And how do we teach students to interface and be reflective about the power that Google has, the content it shows, but also the content that it does not show? It's a difficult question.
Dr. Cynthia Noble is amazing, and if you don't follow her on Twitter or just in her general publishing life, you should. She has a book coming out that's called Algorithms of Oppression.
It's out.
Oh, yeah, February 20, yeah, okay, great.
Go get it today.
It's in my Amazon book cart. So she writes a lot about algorithms and search engines, and her research example is that she used to do searches, or would do searches for Black girls, and to see what would come back. And so similarly, if you think about that first slide where I did a search for librarians, this is how, like, if I'm like, I want to be a librarian, what does a librarian look like? Bless you. And I do a search for librarian, and I see people that are surrounded by books, which is kind of the classic physical representation of information in a lot of ways. But there's a lot of women in these pictures. There's only 2 men. There's only 2 obvious people of color in these. So like, this is how like my community is represented in a search. In a search for that image. And so Cynthia Noble did a research on Black girls and what comes back when you search for Black girls, and it's a lot of pornographic material. And that is how people see themselves reflected in their communities. I had a student once that did a search for his own name, which is a very common Latino name, and his search results were all mugshots. People that were criminals. And so if someone's searching that name, you know, a potential employer, someone that wants to learn more about that person, and you look at the images that you're representing, that says a lot about those people and those communities. And so a lot of times search engines say like, well, we're just an algorithm. We're just a series of logic in terms of pulling back information, but humans create those algorithms.
And make decisions going into how they play out.
Right, which can be really problematic. So part of doing critical information literacy is getting others to see that search engines might have a bias because people are behind technology. And when people create technology, they reflect
Intentionally or
those bias.
unintentionally reflects those. So we got a couple other examples, but we're going to move on to paywalls, the cost of information, the power dynamics, and the kind of issues that surround capitalism and how much we must pay for information.
Indigenous cultures.
That's a good one
So
too.
how we access information from indigenous cultures, which sometimes is less appreciated by the academy than traditional forms of publication. There was someone that was doing a presentation that I went to last year on indigenous cultures and research, and a lot of times indigenous culture research is seen as primary research or like very nativism, like, oh, you went and talked to these, you know, local community and groups, but like what kind of scholarly articles did you cite? And so they like privilege professionally or peer-reviewed scholarly articles versus talking to indigenous cultures about their own cultures. And so that's complicated authorship, like whose authority do you prefer?
And last but not least, there is a sort of privileging of text-based materials over other potential forms of expression or forms of transmitting information. And that's part of the academy writing, right? The sort of coin of the realm is the journal article in lots of ways. It is not necessarily creative output or multimedia output or digital humanities, if you want to think about things like that. And that might affect who is allowed to succeed and who can access, who can gain tenure, things of that nature. So we try to teach about all these sorts of things.
Right, and these last two tie into an information literacy concept that's authority is constructed and contextual. So who we decide has the authority to talk about things all depends on the culture and, that surrounds it, and who gets published, who gets suppressed in terms of disseminating that information.
So for our discussion point for you this time, we have a
That
different idea.
ties to very
Oh, yes, publishing too. We have a sort of drawn from maybe more real life around the university example this time. A student comes up to you, the librarian, and wants you to tell them all about how they can find information on the health dangers of vaccines. How do you help them? How should you help them? And how might these theories and concepts we've talked about be reflected in choices you make as you help them? Discuss.
Okay, let's follow What's your
It's a good question. Not for the issue that
You're automatically
Even you are.
But at least we're looking at where maybe I want to.
Like I've learned a lot about that.
That's our first.
Or automatically.
Also recording.
Find stuff that support their timing and as opposed to some suggestion
It's your job as a librarian to provide some.
No, I'm saying it's more.
I mean, but all this is based on my assumption. So, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm pretty confident here. But, you know, then that puts you in a position of power. What if I, maybe in this case,
A lot of people can
maybe there's another
And then another person.
it's not as clear cut. I still think I mean, I think that's why, you
But if you're in a public library and something comes up,
work through it together as far as how you would go
is
about
it your
your
job to
resources.
teach them
information literacy?
yes, or they
also
are
going to
easily identifiable what they're looking for, so what they're looking for, not what
So
you
you go to.
But I would use my policy to show them what their
But I'm all going to try the other side as well, for sure.
But people in say,
Okay, let's discuss as a group again. We want to make sure we get through all of our context. So, what do you think? How would you deal with this situation, and how does it reflect some of the concepts we've been sort of floating at you today? This is a good one to have because many people in the room actually are librarians this time, but of course many of you are not. So, what do you think?
One issue we were dealing with is what is your role as a librarian?
Yeah, what's your role? Not to have a working pen, that's my role, apparently.
The black one also by the computer
Let's
work.
try this one first. You're right, we'll just use the black one by the computer. Okay, what is your role as a librarian?
Well, I think what came down at this table, and I heard the protagonist correctly, is that sometimes your role is simply to help someone answer the question they want to ask, and sometimes your role is to help someone understand information literacy. And we didn't have enough time to really resolve, but
Oh, 2 minutes wasn't enough time
Yeah.
for
Well,
that debate?
to say it would be in the what the context of the interaction is.
Other thoughts? How would you navigate this? situation.
We talked about assessing the authorship of various resources, and leading the asker to, ways to assess the information, and trying to provide them with a bunch or a plethora of sources from various authors in hopes that maybe they could come to, the conclusion that we hope they would come to, but also understand that they have different values and beliefs than we do. Or maybe we share the same beliefs, but the idea is to provide them access to a whole bunch of sources.
Something I think is interesting about this scenario is, as someone who does do a lot of reference, is how much should I interrogate them about why they're here or what their purpose is? And how does that play into like the power dynamic between me and them as someone who might be a teacher or facilitator? So if someone just comes up and says, hey, I want to know about the health dangers of vaccines, should I be saying, why do you want to know about that? Or should I not?
There's the right to the person's privacy.
Yes, I think so, yep. John looks like
We
he's
were
desperate
talking
to say
about
something.
interrogating, not necessarily why you want it,
Mhm.
but sort of the idea of implicit bias, that if you're looking for danger, there's a presupposition there. Are you looking for information about vaccines, or are you looking to support a specific point of view?
That's a good question.
And
Yeah.
another approach would be just finding out what do they already know.
Yeah, so inviting them to share with you, which I think in most cases we would agree creates a more open line of communication and is less a, hey, I'm gonna tell you what to do sort of thing. Okay?
Well, John had a really good illustration of how this could be problematic. How do I build a bomb?
Yeah, and I used to work in a public library, and I did actually one day have the tell me about pipe bombs question. It was good, it was a real,
Challenging.
what do I do thing. Do I give you the anarchist cookbook? Do I ask you if you want to make a bomb? What do I say?
And who do you tell?
Yeah. I did give him the anarchist cookbook, by the way. I hope they didn't go build a bomb later. But yeah, it's a great example, and this is a kind of middle ground one, but man, they're loaded ones. So let's move on to the third one, where we have much more discussion for you, which is the idea of cataloging and how power dynamics are reflected in the organizing and cataloging of information.
So this is a
there's
tweet I saw last week that I shared with Mike, and I was like, this is perfect for our talk. So books about indigenous peoples are automatically classified under history,
What?
even if they're about current events. So if you look at anything related to like Native American cultures, even current, like what is happening right now. Like I looked up Native American education, and there's a book that came out last year about like current education.